there, students of economics, and welcome to this teaching module titled Economic Reforms 1991. So far, we have learned about the state of the Indian economy on the eve of independence. We went on to learn about the state of the economy during the time period 1950 to 1990. Now we're moving on forward to learn about what panned out in our country from 1991 onwards. Are you with me? Yeah, so let us go on then. In this teaching module, we will learn about the features and characteristics of the economic crisis 1991. We will learn about the causes of this economic crisis that took place in 1991. Then we'll go on to learn about some key economic terms related to these topics. We studied in the previous chapter that India followed a mixed economic system. However, the controlling heights were in the hands of the public sector. And so there were many rules and restrictions in the private sector. And probably this led to what we call as an economic crisis way back in 1991. And what we're going to learn forward is what were the features of this crisis, what really happened, what were the events that occurred at this time in the year 1991. Thereafter, we will learn about the causes of this economic crisis. What were the features or characteristics of the economic crisis of 1991? In the late 1980s, government expenditure exceeded its revenue by large margins. What this meant that the government was spending more than what it was earning in terms of revenue. In 1991, India met with an economic crisis relating to its external debt or loans. The government was not able to make repayments of the borrowings from abroad. Let us now look at the features or characteristics of the economic crisis. What were the events that took place at the time of the crisis in 1991 in our economy? The national income was growing at the rate of only 0.8%. We know that the national income tells us about the value of goods and services produced in our economy. And it looks like from the statistics that it was not growing. Inflation reached the height of 16.8%. Now we know that inflation figures tell us about the rate at which prices are rising. And this too is a bleak picture. Balance of payments crisis was to the extent of 10,000 crores, which means that the export earnings were far less than the import expenditure. So the difference between the two was 10,000 crores. India was a highly indebted country. It was paying 30,000 crores of just interest charges per year on international loans. Foreign exchange reserves were only $1.8 billion, which was sufficient for only 3 weeks of paying for imports. India sold a large amount of gold to the Bank of England. Now moving on. India applied for a loan from the World Bank and the IMF to the extent of $7 billion US. The World Bank is also known as the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, in short IBRD. And we know the IMF is the International Monetary Fund. So we see that India was already in a state of debt where the external loans were concerned. The fiscal deficit was more than 7.5%, and this clearly reflects to us that expenditures in our economy were far more than what we were earning in terms of revenues. So therefore, deficit financing was around 3%. Deficit financing means all the ways in which we try to control the deficit situation. Trade relations with the Soviet bloc had broken down, which meant that our exports had declined. With this part of the world. Remittances, or income earned by non-residents who are working in other countries, when they send their money earned back home to our country, we call them remittances. So remittances from non-resident Indians stopped due to the Gulf War in the Arab countries. The price of petroleum products was very high, and so the consumers also suffered, and so also industries. Under the leadership of the late Prime Minister Narasimha Rao and the then Finance Minister Manmohan Singh, India approached the IBRD and the IMF and received a loan of $7 billion US. We just learned that. However, this loan was granted on the condition that India would open up the economy by removing restrictions on the private sector, by reducing the role of the government, and by removing trade restrictions. India agreed to the conditions of the World Bank and the IMF and announced the new economic policy, in short NEP, in 1991. Under this policy, the government initiated or started a variety of policies under the headings liberalization, privatization, and globalization. Well, globalization is an outcome of the policies of liberalization and privatization. It is interesting to note that the father of the new economic policy is the then Finance Minister Manmohan Singh. Now let us study what were the causes of the economic crisis 1991. In other words, how and why did this economic crisis come about? What were the factors that led to this economic crisis? It's very important to know the causes behind the crisis that we landed up with, right? So the first one is increase in fiscal deficit. Now we know that fiscal deficit is when expenditures are more than receipts. It is the difference between total expenditure and total receipts in the economy. The government generates funds from various sources, right? Such as taxation, running of public sector undertakings, and so on. Now, when expenditure is more than income or revenue earned, the government borrows to finance the deficit from people, from domestic and international banks. Now, since the government expenditure was more than income, the government incurred a debt which had to be paid in foreign exchange. We know that the loans or borrowings of the government were from international lenders, and so it meant that our foreign exchange reserves would have been decreasing. On the other hand, the second cause was low revenue. Even though the revenues were low, the government had tried to increase its revenues to meet problems like unemployment, poverty, population explosion. The continuous spending on development programs of the government did not generate any additional revenue. The third cause of the economic crisis of 1991 was high public expenditure. The government was spending a large share of its income on areas which did not give any immediate returns. For example, social security schemes and defense. There was a need to use resources in a more efficient and productive manner. The income from public sector undertakings was also not very high to meet the growing expenditures. The fourth cause, increase in consumption expenditure. You know, at times, our foreign exchange borrowed from other countries and international financial institutions was spent on meeting consumption needs. There was no attempt made to reduce spending or to increase exports. So that means whatever was borrowed from international lenders was not spent to kind of reinvest or invest in productive places or areas where we could be earning more revenue. Rather, we were borrowing and we were spending for consumption needs. And so that clearly meant that the economy was not growing. When we were learning about the features of the economic crisis, we came across various economic terms such as balance of payments, national income, inflation, fiscal deficit, and deficit financing. Let us now study these economic terms in a more better way. So what is balance of payments? Balance of payments is a statistical statement that contains all the external transactions, that is receipts and payments on the current and capital account in which the country is involved over a period of time with other countries. Here is another definition. The balance of payments of a country is a systematic record of all economic transactions between the residents of a country and the residents of the rest of the world. This definition is given by the Reserve Bank of India. You could learn any one of these definitions. Now, as the BOP or the balance of payments shows the total assets and obligations over a time period, and that is of one financial year, it always balances. We come across this term inflation very often, right? What is inflation? Now, inflation is a situation of sustained rise in the general price level in an economy. Let me give you an illustration to help you to understand what inflation is all about. Say, for example, way back in 2010, you paid around rupees 45 for a breakfast meal. For the same amount that you had in 2010, you are paying now in 2019, for example, a price of rupees 90. So you can see it looks like the figure has almost doubled. Well, for the same amount of food that we bought around 9 years back, we are now paying double the amount. So that means that over a period of time, prices of all goods and services goes up, and this is called inflation. Of course, the values that are shown are just to illustrate. Now, inflation, since it is a situation of rise in prices, it obviously means that we are getting less value for our money. Inflation reduces the standard of living and raises the cost of living. You know, our purchasing power or our ability to buy goods and services decreases on account of this situation called inflation. Moving on to the next term, which is national income. What is national income? It is the total money value or the worth of only final goods and services produced in an economy during a period of one financial year. It also includes the income earned from abroad. So here you have a formula. You don't need to learn the formula per se at this level, but I have just put it up for your knowledge. Now let us define what is fiscal deficit and deficit financing. Fiscal deficit is the difference between total expenditure and total receipts of the government. Now, total receipts is divided into two, revenue receipts and capital receipts. Now, those receipts, that means borrowings, are not included here while calculating the value of fiscal deficit. Let us define fiscal deficit. What is it? It is a situation when the expenditures of the government exceeds the revenues of the government. In other words, government expenditures are greater than government revenues. I'd like you to note here at this point, the word revenue does not mean profit. It only means the income that is earned per se. And in this case, if you're talking about the government, we mean the income or revenue earned by means of taxation or by running of public sector undertakings. Do not confuse the term revenues with profit. Revenue is the income that is earned without any deductions. Moving on to the next term, which is deficit financing. What is deficit financing? It is the borrowings of the government from banks and also from people within the country, as well as borrowing from international financial institutions. Why? In order to finance the fiscal deficit that we just spoke about. Here we have an illustration to tell you what is deficit financing. So we have two caricatures here. They are stakeholders probably. There's a deficit and they're asking each other, what should we do? And the other guy tells him, we should borrow more. But borrowing should result in use of the amount that is borrowed in productive activities or investments that are going to yield profits for the economy, and thereby with the help of borrowings we should be able to bring about GDP growth. It should propel us to growth in the economy rather than borrowing and spending on consumption, right? So children, today we have learned about the characteristics of the economic crisis 1991. What were the events essentially? What were the features? Then we went on to learn about why it came about. What were the causes of the economic crisis? And lastly, we learned some more economic terms, that is BOP or balance of payments, national income, inflation, fiscal deficit, and deficit financing. I always like to end my videos with some quotes or thoughts or values. And here are some excellent quotes by Warren Buffett. You know, as students like economics, you need to Google up on this personality named Warren Buffett. He is a smart investor. He's one of the richest men in the world. He is from the US and he is a philanthropist. He is a very smart investor. He invests in shares and that's how he makes his money. He holds huge stakes in companies as well. Now, here are his quotes. On earning, he says, never depend on a single income. Make investment to create a second source. On spending, he says, if you buy things you do not need, soon you will have to sell things you need. On savings, he says, do not save what is left after spending, but spend what is left after saving. This one is my favorite. On taking risks, he says, never test the depth of river with both the feet. On investment, he says, do not put all eggs in one basket, which means do not invest only in shares of one company. Diversify your investments and buy shares of different companies after studying their fundamentals, their profits, and so on. On expectations, he says, honesty is a very expensive gift. Do not expect it from cheap people. So, students, thank you so much for giving me a listening ear. Stay blessed.